Back in 1988, at the age of 25, I went to Madison Square Garden to hear the Grateful Dead for the first time. I went at the behest of jazz pianist and musical innovator Cecil Taylor. And when we got there, Ornette Coleman was there. Yes, it's all true, folks. Cecil Taylor, Ornette Coleman, the Grateful Dead, and me. Not such an unlikely story, but it's one that we're going to have today on the podcast. Welcome to the ProgCast, everybody. I'm Greg Bendian. Just want to start by saying thank you to everybody for all the great feedback we've been getting. Really appreciate your enthusiasm for this kind of musical discourse. We've been doing it now since August, and it's really going strong. We're having an amazing diversity of people come and talk to us about the inner workings of their musical minds. And I also thank everybody for the warm response to me telling stories from my past that I think are fun and have some historical connection to the continuum of music, creative music. And today's is no exception to that. And I do appreciate people requesting this story. And when I started working on it, to really put it together to talk to you all about it, it came together really nicely in a way that means that I'll have not just a witness, but an instigator to this incident to talk to today. And many of you will know him as a Grateful Dead devotee and a person who's worked with the organization for a really long time and had a radio show with Phil Lesh called Eyes of Chaos, Veil of Ardor on KPFA. He also has a Sirius satellite radio show called Tales of the Golden Road, and he is the founder and editor of the Grateful Dead Almanac. So I'm very happy to welcome bassist and guitarist Gary Lambert. How you doing, Gary?
Hey, Greg, it's great to see you. Great to hear you. It's been a long time.
Has been a while, but we go back a ways, and that's to say that we've sort of both been around the New York scene for 30 plus years, right?
Yeah, well, I grew up here. Then I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 30 years, which I now call a nice visit because I returned to New York uh, around 2004 and have been back more or less permanently ever since. But the New York scene of the late 60s, early 70s had a profound influence on me. It's where I first encountered people like Ornette and Cecil and Pharoah Sanders and many others who had an enormous impact on my musical consciousness. And the Grateful Dead were part of that from 1968, 30 years before you encountered them at the Garden. Or is it? Yes,
20.
20 years. Excuse me,
20,
20.
yeah.
Yeah, don't want to
That's
age you too
right.
much.
20, it was that. Now, I meant to ask you, well, we'll get to that later, but I'm curious about the timeline on the series of shows that we're talking about
Yeah.
from September of '88. But we'll get back to
Actually,
what you're saying.
87. We're talking about fall of 87.
Let me jump in and tell a little bit of background how my end of this comes together. I obviously as a jazz drummer and looking into the avant-garde, I got very interested in the avant-garde jazz music of so many of the great guys like Ornette and Cecil Taylor. Um, Studied Cecil's music, studied with his drummers, Andrew Cyril and Steve McCall. And that led me to be able to connect with Cecil musically. He came to a gig that we did at the Knitting Factory with my band. And eventually we started hanging out. So in '87 is when this started because I remember we were playing at the original Knitting Factory, and he came down there. I've seen you there perform, I think, with Henry Kaiser and other people. And so we started hanging out. Like he would call me to go to see the Kabuki, or he'd call me to go. I remember one time he called me, "Hey Bendian, do you want to go see the new Vim Vendors, Wings of Desire?" And we saw that at Lincoln Center, and that was a great hang. Um, I remember he got mad at me for fidgeting during the movie. He said, "Fidget much at the movies?" But he put up with me. I tagged along. We would go to the Vanguard everywhere he went. That he was treated like a king of the music. That was great to see the respect that the door guy at the Vanguard or um, Sweet Basil. We just walk into these places and hang and listen to this stuff, and he could go real long hangs. And luckily I was in my early 20s still, so I could make the hang. So he would call me for things. We would, go to hang out in the village and just talk to his friends. He had a lot of artist friends in the village, so it was a really incredible experience to experience a New York artist like that and be able to just see what it was all about. And then I started trying to get him to hire me. And he had heard my stuff. He heard my stuff with Derek Bailey, which is I think what did the trick. But one of the hangs that he called me for, Gary Lambert, was a 4 o'clock afternoon call. I believe that's accurate. And he said, first thing he said to me was, "Bendian, what are you doing tonight?" I said, "I'm not doing anything." He said, "Do you want to go to Madison Square Garden with me to see the Grateful Dead? They've invited me." And he was really like, he was jazzed about it. It was neat. It was like I could tell also that he knew I'd appreciate this, right? So he didn't just call one of his older friends. He's like, "Oh, I'll take this guy. I'm going to blow his mind. And that was really beautiful and generous. Um, and so he said, "Yeah, they want us to come down. They want to meet me." I said, "That's great, Cecil. Let's do that. At what time?" And I think it was something like 6 o'clock. Go to this entrance at the garden that I've never been to before. And we went down. It was like sort of down this ramp area. Does that sound right? And then we went right backstage. And I think I'll pause there for a second. And Gary, why don't you please set up sort of, I know your relationship with the Dead predates this, but give us some of that and maybe, tell us about how this whole thing started.
Well, my relationship with the Dead as a fan predated it by many years. Um, and then my primary entree into their inner circle um, during the 1980s took place because I was working for the great rock impresario Bill Graham in San Francisco.
I know.
And so that increased my contact with the Dead. I'd had some previous contact. I'd interviewed Bob Weir during a fitful career of mine as a music journalist in the 70s. But once I was working for BGP, I would come into contact with the Dead more often. And specifically, I was working for a little unit within Bill Graham Presents that was invested in promoting all the stuff that wasn't really mainstream rock, primarily on the club level, occasionally larger concerts. But I was part of this team that promoted jazz and reggae and African and blues and
Oh,
R&B.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that, Gary.
Yeah, well, Bill Graham was a great champion of all that music. Uh, and his company, often had to buy into the conventional wisdom of the music business and present stuff that was considered commercially viable. But Bill always wanted to have a component that was advocating for that kind of music. Of course, if you look at the old Fillmore posters, or you
I do.
or you absorb the folklore of the Fillmore and Fillmore East, you'd have these amazing bills where Rosson Roland Kirk would be playing with Santana.
I look at those all the time because I just say, look at that, and it became such a prototype for places like the Bottom Line.
Right, right. And, one of the completely mind-altering shows I saw at Fillmore East was Laura Nero at the peak of her powers, just on solo piano. And her concerts were like these devotional events. Opening for her were Miles Davis and the Bitches Brew Band, with both Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea on keys, Jack DeJohnette on drums, Dave Holland on bass, Airto on percussion.
I have the box set here.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, Bill's ethos, as in his own words, was don't give the public what they want, give them what they should want. And he also used to say about the kids who came to rock shows, he said they've got to eat their broccoli before they get their ice cream. So that was his notion of putting these amazing artists, and not just jazz art, blues, R&B. You'd see Buddy Guy and Junior Wells opening for Jefferson Airplane. You'd see actually there was a bill with B.B. King headlining and Pharoah Sanders second. Just incredible juxtapositions, to turn people on to music that would not otherwise be available to them.
And wasn't there also a Laura Nyro Crazy Horse?
No, it was Miles with Crazy Horse. Miles, the bill was Miles, then Steve Miller, then Neil Young and Crazy Horse. And Miles didn't care for Steve Miller, so he deliberately showed up late, so he would go on after Steve Miller, which Bill Graham was none too happy with, although he probably thought, yeah, it's probably artistically the right thing. But anyway, so in that atmosphere, I grew up and became. I always was a person of very eclectic taste, and Bill only enhanced that with what he made a bit available musically. So when I was working for Bill, by the '80s, that was more rare. Bill didn't have as much leeway to do those kinds of shows with those eclectic bills because billings were being dictated by booking agents. They say, okay, if you want the Who, you've got to have this other act that we booked to open for them, and that was in part reason that Bill closed the Fillmore East. He no longer had that latitude to do those things. So he became somewhat more of a conventional rock promoter, but he was also absolutely the best at it. And whenever he had the opportunity, he would still do, shortly before I started working for Bill, I remember there was, a run of shows at the, Warfield Theater in San Francisco, by I think the Dead played a run of shows, and then a few weeks after that, he had Twyla Tharp's dance company for a week. That's what.
Well, he was a theater guy, right?
He originally came out of theater. He wanted to be an actor. He was a frustrated actor.
Right.
Came into producing rock shows by way of being the business manager of the San Francisco Mime Troupe, which, if people think of mime as the guys with white face, doing annoying, pushing the invisible wall kind of stuff. San Francisco Mime Troupe was, in fact, sort of a guerrilla political theater company.
Street stuff, right?
In the parks. They would get busted for performing in the parks without permits. So Bill Graham's very first concert that he promoted was a benefit for the San Francisco Mime Troupe to bail them out because they'd been busted. And then he started doing shows at the Fillmore. And in fact, John Handy was on one of his very first shows, along with the former Warlocks. The Grateful Dead had just changed their name to the Grateful Dead. So that was always part of Bill's mission, was to turn people on to stuff that was not normally commercially available. And after I'd started working for him, people there found out that I was very conversant in all these different kinds of music. So I got to be part of this little team that promoted all the stuff that fell between the cracks, all the stuff that was thought to be non-commercial. And in my first year of doing that, in 1980, I started there in 83. In 84, promoted a couple of shows by Ornette Coleman in Primetime.
Oh, really?
Yeah. At our club called Wolfgang's, which was about I guess in seated capacity was about 600. It could also have a dance floor for rock, and also a place with an incredibly eclectic booking policy. We'd have the Beastie Boys, and then later that week we'd have the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and then we'd have John Hyatt and Ry Cooder. It was a fantastic club. So I'd been a fan of Ornette's for many years. I'd first seen him in 1972 at Artist House, his own loft.
Oh, you saw Artist House?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Completely, mind-blowing experience, of course.
Do you remember the Artist House gig?
Yeah, very well. It was Ornette, Eddie Blackwell, Charlie Hayden, and Dewey Redman. Don Cherry was in the band at that point, but he wasn't there that night. And they did two sets, but they were considered two discrete shows. Like I think they were, you could stay for the second show, but they played exactly the same set list, both shows. And I was utterly gratified for that because it took me the second show to absorb you know, what I heard in the
That's
first.
a great experience. That's a great
Yeah,
way to do it. Do it
yeah,
two times right up front. Yeah.
yeah. You know, it's like going to see the same symphony twice or anything like that. You become acquainted with the structure. So that was fantastic. So I've been a fan of Ornette's for, you know, already more than a decade when I first promoted this show with Primetime, and got to meet Ornette and Donardo, and we hit it off immediately. Then Ornette and I found out we had the same birthday, March 9th. So that, you know, that became a part of our relationship. And then they came back, I think the next year or a year after that, we had them a second time. So,
Now let's just jump in for a second. That's the which lineup of primetime, please.
well, Jamaluddin, Al McDowell, Bern Nix, of course, Donardo. This was before he got Dave Bryan on keyboards. It was a keyboardless version. I'm not
Yeah.
remembering everybody.
Would it be two guitars though? Would it be Charlie Ellerby as well?
Yeah, yeah. Charlie Ellerby was in that lineup. Yeah, yeah. So Byrne, Charlie, Jamaluddin, and then that I think pretty much that lineup came back. Maybe Jamaluddin was gone by that point. I really you know, I can't recall for sure. But so by the time 1987 rolled around, I already had this deepening relationship with Ornette and Donardo, and it was in 1987 that Phil Lesh and I hooked up and started doing this radio show. Now, that came about by a pretty interesting happenstance. I had helped KPFA in Berkeley with their fundraising activities, and one of their fundraising activities in 1986, the Grateful Dead, who were great supporters of Pacific Radio and KPFA, allowed KPFA to broadcast one of their shows from the Greek Theater in Berkeley. And that was the centerpiece of a day-long fundraising marathon, which at the time shattered all fundraising records, you know, and brought all these deadheads into the KPFA tent, which was a fantastic thing. So later that year, the Dead then gave their blessing to KPFA broadcasting their New Year's Eve show from the Henry J. Kaiser Convention Center in Oakland. And I was going to host that and help produce it. So for that particular broadcast, the production team was talking about, what are we going to do during intermission? You know, the intermissions of these things are always, you know, a lot of dead air because you never know how long the break the band is going to take. It's kind of dictated by when midnight rolls around on New Year's Eve, you know, so there was going to be about 45 minutes of time that needed filling. And they said, well, why don't we take a remote mic out in the crowd and interview deadheads? And I sort of said, that's, you know, that's kind of a crapshoot. You don't know how articulate people are going to be. It could be really chaotic, you know. And then I said, why don't we let the Grateful Dead be guest DJs for this break? Why don't we? I didn't mean actually sitting at turntables and picking out records, but in advance of the gig, I said, why don't we ask the members of the Grateful Dead to pick out one or two pieces of music they would like played during the intermission? And exactly as I hoped, they came up with this extraordinarily eclectic list. I think Bob Weir said he wanted Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness and a collaboration by Duke Ellington and Frank Sinatra from a record they made in the 60s.
Yeah.
On the tune Poor Butterfly. Mickey Hart, of course, picked something from, you know, Papua New Guinea or something like that, you know, endangered music from a rainforest. Bill Kreuzman said anything by Coltrane with Elvin Jones on it. And Jerry Garcia, I think, deliberately tried to trip me up because he went really obscure. He said, there's a 16th century Italian Renaissance Christmas carol. And there's a song by the Fairfield Four of Richmond, Virginia called All Things Are Possible. And I found both of them. So
Wow.
so I was happy with that. And then Phil Lesh said, well, the thing I'd really like you to play on the radio is an hour-long symphony by this dead British guy named Havergal Brian. So you can't do it because it's too long. It would take up the whole break and more. So I sort of put that notion in my back pocket. We came up with a great amount of music for the break anyway. There was plenty to fill the time. And then just after that New Year's Eve, I got in touch with Phil and I said, hey, you know, I'm sure if you ever wanted to come on KPFA and play that in a freestanding space, play that Havergal Brian symphony, you know, we could arrange it. And now Phil was sort of the Dead's emissary to the avant-garde in a lot of ways. You know, they had this philanthropic organization that some of your listeners might know about called the Rex Foundation, which has been raising millions and millions of dollars for all kinds of worthy causes for going on 40 years now. Um, you know, environmental causes, educational causes, all kinds of social justice stuff. Um, and they've supported a lot of people in the arts. And Phil's specialty was kind of arranging for grants or, you know, bringing greater attention to composers and improvisers of adventurous, you know, not, music considered not at all commercially viable. And they had given some grants to composers in England, including the foundation. Havergal Brian was deceased, but there was a foundation overseeing his music. Uh, they helped underwrite recordings by composers like Chris Dench, Michael Finnessy, Harrison Birtwistle was a favorite of Phil's. So, you know, that was kind of his thing. So I invited him to come on KPFA and play some Havergal Brian. And to my astonishment, he came back and said, well, why just do that once? Why not make a regular radio show out of it?
Oh, I see.
Because Phil had deep roots at KPFA. He had been a volunteer at KPFA in 1962. You know, that some of his first interactions with Jerry Garcia took place there. So he had great affection for the channel. And I said, yeah, let's make a radio show out of it. And we got a monthly slot. We started in June of 1987. And our mission was playing all kinds of music, you know, really without stylistic boundaries, except it had to be, you know, the weirder the better, the more transgressive the better,
Hmm.
the fewer outlets it had to be played elsewhere the better. So it was really, we'd been doing this show for a few months as of September of 1987, and the Dead were coming to play Madison Square Garden. This was, mind you, just after they'd had this incredible career breakthrough with a top 10 album and a hit single after years of, you know, not being considered at all mainstream.
Yeah, the
Even
hit
though
single was
Touch of Grey,
Touch of Grey.
the album was In the Dark, both of which went top 10, you know, unheard of in Grateful Dead history.
Yeah, it
Nothing,
is.
yeah. And so their audience had grown enormously, so they could sell out multiple nights at Madison Square Garden. I think that the year, this particular year, '87, I think they did 6 or 8 nights. I can't remember, but
Yeah, were they consecutive nights? Do you remember around when they were?
they would usually. It was September of '87. I think the night that you guys came out had been September 20th. But you know, they usually, if they were doing a long run, there would be like maybe 3 nights, a break, 3 more nights or whatever. But yeah, they you know, and they sold it out effortlessly at that point. The following year, I think they played 9 nights at the Garden, and they were also selling out stadiums, outdoor, you know, places. So they had this enormous popularity, but they still always were intent on turning their audience onto new stuff. A couple of years before, they'd had Baba Olatunji and his Drums of Passion open for them on New Year's Eve, which was, you know, just absolutely transcendent. And they would bring in people like Hamza Eldin and Ayrto and Flora, and that was through Mickey Hart's connection to the world music community. So they were always about, you know, trying to turn on their audience to new stuff. And in '87, Phil and I had this new outlet for doing that. So I just kind of idly said to him, you know, Phil, you know, we've got this radio show. We're reaching out to the new music community. We had been to the Knitting Factory together. I think maybe during that '87 run, I think we went to see Anthony Braxton together. Knitting Factory pretty recently opened at that point. I think.
Right, it was new when we
Yeah.
were playing there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I said to Phil, you know, Ornette lives 2 blocks from the Garden. Yeah. Wouldn't it be cool if we invited him and DiNardo to come to a show? And Phil said, oh yeah, let's do that. And so we did that from our end. Uh, and Dan Healy, the Dead Sound Man, you'll probably remember, like, set up seats, you know, right at the soundboard.
Yes, we sat at the soundboard.
Yeah, so you could have absolutely the sweetest spot, you know, in the place for sound, and you know, but you were also kind of like, you had privacy. You know, it was like,
And I think they were raised seats.
yeah,
So
there was a little bit of a riser. Yeah,
yeah, it was nice.
yeah, it was a real nice setup, and so Yeah, I made the arrangements with Ornette and Donardo. They were delighted to take me up on it. And then I come out to the seats and I see Cecil, with you. And I had no idea that was happening. That was a complete surprise to
I had
me.
no idea.
No, I later found out, if I have it right, that this was arranged. There was a mutual friend of Cecil's and the band within the Grateful Dead organization. And this woman has an incredible backstory. There was a woman named Calico. She was known as Calico uh, to the Deadhead world. She was a member of the Hog Farm commune with Wavy Gravy. She had been
Okay.
at Woodstock with the Hog Farm. She traveled the world with the Hog Farm. Um, and she was sort of this like hippie den mother, these long gray pigtails and the sort of peasant dress. And
Wait a minute. Trudy?
no, her real name was Elizabeth.
Okay.
Uh, but uh, I had no idea that she had any connection to Cecil or anyone like that. What I found out sometime later was that Calico was, in fact, a woman named Elizabeth van der Meij. She was from the Netherlands. And in the 50s and early 60s, she had come to the States, had been a jazz journalist and did jazz radio, and was old friends with Cecil. She knew Ornette as well. And she had lived with Eric Dolphy, you know. And nothing prepared that I knew about this wonderful, sweet, hippie woman prepared me for this knowledge. But she was apparently the driving force between getting Cecil to the show. And the planets lined up to the point that the invitation to Ornette and Cecil were for the same night.
Yeah.
And there we all were together. So just
Well,
imagine.
that's funny that you say you were surprised because we didn't know Ornette was going to be there.
Right, right.
So my shock was when we go backstage, picking up where I left off, literally was that point we're going backstage for the first time because we went back during intermission.
Right.
But I remember we walked in, we saw you met us, right?
Yeah.
And then you were surprised to see Cecil, or you saw Cecil earlier?
No, I think that was my first
Okay.
sighting of Cecil as
And
well.
then you said, "Come on, guys," and we went back into this beautifully decorated space that I think was Phil Lesh's
Right.
area.
I think that was at halftime. That was not before the show. I think that's when I brought you back at halftime because that's where the actual meetings took place
Okay.
with the band. Yeah.
So what did we do before halftime, the first time?
I'm not. I remember meeting Ornette and Donardo, and then I think I maybe just met you guys out of the seats. Maybe someone directed you there other than me, but I definitely remember being surprised. Whenever it was, I was surprised to see Cecil and delighted. Um, and then you know, the first set took place, and yeah, the first set of a Dead show is always kind of the band sort of getting the feel of the room and warming up, and they play. It's more songs oriented rather than
Well,
improv.
yes, and I'd love to tell you about my experience on that, but go
Yeah.
ahead.
Uh, of course, on this night, I barely watched the band. I watched those guys watching the band. It was like I kept looking at Ornette and Cecil, and just the difference in their demeanor as people. Anyway, was one level, but Ornette always just had this sort of like inscrutable smile on his face, and he was just taking it in. And absorbing it, and Cecil's a little more animated. Like Cecil's head was moving to it, and um, I was really yeah. I didn't discuss in any depth what their take on the music was, but I just watched them. You know,
So you got to watch that from a different angle.
yeah,
That yeah, it was as you recall, it was songs, and I know that they sounded really good.
yeah,
I guess they were aware that the guys were there, um, but that would become more evident later. I'll
right,
get to that in a second. But I remember that after the song set, which was great, Jerry sounded great, played great solos. It was really cool. We went backstage, and when Phil came in to meet us, Cecil like enthusiastically said, "Well, we sure heard some American music tonight."
right,
You remember
right,
that?
right. That may have followed what I think was the first thing, because I actually got, I mean, getting to make these introductions, you know,
Right.
in my, it was like saying Ornette Coleman, Jerry Garcia, Ornette Coleman. Like hearing those words come out of my own mouth was just, you know, William Shakespeare, Aristotle, William Shakespeare. You know, it was one of those dream. You know, people always do the hypothetical your dream dinner. You know, I was living my dream dinner, and when I took Cecil over to Phil, and the first thing I recall Cecil saying to Phil was, "Man, who does your lighting?"
Oh yeah, he did. Nice.
And I think Phil went and got Candace, who was the lighting director, and they met because Cecil was always so interested with the visual, you know, and you know he was so into the interdisciplinary thing
And also just and production.
yeah, the whole experience.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's not a coincidence. The next time I saw Cecil, he played solo at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and the lighting was like there was something a little dead-like about the lighting, you know, in a subtle way, which is not, which, you know, people. If you think of Grateful Dead lighting, you might think of like people being blasted with psychedelic light shows. So it wasn't like that.
No,
Their lighting was very subtle and very nuanced, you know,
I remember
and
that. Yeah,
yeah,
it looked like a good show.
yeah. So yeah, so Cecil asked about the lighting first, and then the American music quote was beautiful too. Um,
And I
and yeah,
remember Phil delighted in that. You know, I think
yeah,
everybody had a really wow. You know, it was very nice.
yeah, yeah. And then you know the set the hang at the break, you know, by necessity kind of brief because you know it's like what half an hour or whatever, you know, and everyone wants to meet everybody. So, but it was really incredible to see those little moments of interaction, and then going back out for the second set. And of course, in the second set is when things open up a little more.
Well, this is what I remember.
Yeah.
So, a couple of interesting moments were Phil came up to me and he said, "Greg, I heard that you were just in London with Derek Bailey." And I did you tell him that?
No, maybe Cecil did in the course of their conversation.
Oh, I don't know, but it was really funny because I knew that Phil was into all the deepest shit. You know, like
yeah,
I knew his reputation. I knew he had studied with Barrio. I knew that he had, you know, gotten seriously uh, into his musicality on a multiple classical level, and that
right.
I always really appreciated and respected that about him. So for him to say, "I know who Derek Bailey is, and I care that you played with him,"
Yeah,
was a really great moment for me. And we talked about that, and then we talked about Barrio and some other stuff. I remember I wanted to hit him up because I was also a big fan of Barrio. You know who was a big fan of Barrio is John McLaughlin.
yeah, yeah. I've heard that.
Yeah, and so there's so many great works. You know, the vocal stuff and the
Yeah,
sequenzas, and there's just so much music. But yeah, so I got a chance to chat with him about that.
it's great.
And then I remember, if you remember this, Phil says to Ornette, "So you're from Texas, and can we talk about the blues?" Do you remember this?
Yes,
And
yes, yes.
Ornette, I don't remember much of what came after that, but I remember that Ornette said to everybody, the only white man that could ever sing the blues was Captain Beefheart.
I missed that. I know I would have dug that when I heard it.
It
Oh
was
man.
not, you know, and I thought, oh man, this is it's all coming together, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
Ornette knows Beefheart stuff.
yeah, yeah. Ornette and Beefheart have spent some time. Interestingly, a guy who's
Because
a very good
Beefheart
friend.
certainly knew the Ornette stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and a very one of the guys. Now coming back to my work for Bill Graham Presents, one of the guys who was part of that little team that produced all the outside music for Bill Graham. Um, Previously had been Beefheart's manager during the it went during Beefheart's San Francisco period, time of Bat Chain Puller and all that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so Ornette and Beefheart have definitely spent time together. That's funny though. Um, yeah, you know that to me is always one of the great, you know, untold stories of the Grateful Dead was the depth and breadth of their musical scholarship and you know, beyond scholarship, just passion for all kinds of, you know, really groundbreaking outsider music. You know, it's reflected, you know, on their album Anthem of the Sun. There they were like, you know, borrowing from Henry Cowell And John Cage, there's Prepared Piano on that album. That's their second album, you know,
Oh,
1967, 68. And, you know, Phil turned all those guys on. You know, they were like rock musicians and bluegrass musicians and R&B musicians. And when he came into that little communal setting, like he would give them psychedelics and sit them down and play them Charles Ives' Fourth Symphony, you know, which was a major work in my life as well as his, you
have you
know.
ever seen it performed live?
Not only have I seen it performed, I first saw it performed live in 1976 by Seiji Ozawa and the Boston Symphony. My brother was at the world premiere, you know, because it didn't premiere till like 11 years after Ives died.
Right.
Stokowski and the American Symphony Orchestra played it at Carnegie Hall. My brother got to go to that. So I got turned on to the world premiere recording of that about a year later. So I was getting turned on to the Beatles and Charles Ives at the same time.
Great.
This is like 1964, 65. And I always have a feeling that had a huge influence on how warped my musical mind is. Those influences, you know, coming at the same time, you know, were really, really formative for me.
Because you
So
didn't know there was anything other than that. That was just the
right,
world for you, right?
right. It just kicked every door open, you know. And so yeah. So in answer to your question, I saw the Ives Fourth in 1976, but one of my greatest and most insane immersions in any piece of music ever was in the early 2000s, maybe it was 2001 or thereabouts. The San Francisco Symphony under Michael Tilson Thomas played the Ives Fourth 4 times in one week, and I went every time. And I always say that, first of all, it was equally or more mind blowing with each accelerating time, but it taught me lessons about improvising with your ears, you know, like listening for different things and
And
changing
it's
your perspective.
spatialized, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, where you're sitting in the hall makes it a different piece.
Mhm.
Um, how engaged each section of the orchestra is, you know, like how engaged the audience is, really, because you know, with music like Ives, you'll occasionally get the restless symphony subscriber vibe out of an audience, you know,
Totally,
like
totally.
they subscribe to the season to hear the greatest hits, to hear Beethoven and the gang, you know, and then if they're subjected to Ives, some of them are going to get it, and others are going to be very restless, and you know, you'll hear the rustling of programs. So seeing Ives four times in a row was as it was like seeing those two Ornette sets in one night that were the same piece, you know.
Oh man, I'm so jealous. I only got to see it once at the New York Phil,
Yeah,
and I was sitting next to a tourist who had just picked up a cheap ticket,
right.
and I was there to have a religious experience.
Yeah,
So, and I do. And when I listen to it at home, that's one thing. But here, you know, I was going to hear Watchmen tell us of the night,
yes,
and I just burst into tears, and it just was so heavy to me that, you know, the second movement then takes, you know, goes into quarter tone stuff and
yeah, yeah,
just, you know, all the piano stuff and all the different sub ensembles. And you're right, it's so much to listen to that you're like improvising how you're looking at relationships between the different groupings and
yeah,
things, and it's three-dimensional now because it's, you know, you're there and it's right hitting you in real time. That's the difference between the recording and the live experience right there.
sure, yeah.
Wow.
So all that stuff, you know, like it's funny. There were times before I knew that Phil was into Ives that I perceived the Dead's music as Ivesian. There's like this simultaneity of different things going on in their music, and sometimes I've said that sometimes I like their music better when it sounds more like an argument than a conversation. You know, because those guys would try to play everything different every time they played it. You know, never replicate the last performance of it, and you'd have differing intentions or differing ideas of where to go next. You know, and you know that's something that is always present in Ives's written music. You know, he wrote it to make it sound like that, to make it sound like, you know, clashing clashing rhythms, clashing key signatures, you know, all of that stuff. So I very early on in my time as a Deadhead, I said this music really it reminds me of Ives in some ways. And then a few years later, I heard Phil raving about Ives in an interview, and I said, "Oh man, you know," I felt nicely vindicated by that. So anyway, to wind back
I have to
around.
tell you something about the fourth, though.
Yeah.
In my work at Yale Oral History of American Music, they
Uh-huh.
have all the handwritten Ives
Oh
scores
man. Oh, incredible.
at the library.
Oh my God.
And I went up there on more than one occasion to listen and to study from the pencil of Ives.
Yeah.
And the edges of the sheets are decaying.
Yeah.
And it's just like you can smell the barn it was sitting in.
Yeah. Right.
Oh my, it's just, it blew my mind. And then eventually they transferred his house, his room, his music room from his house to a museum at the Arts and Letters
Yeah.
in the Upper Manhattan.
Uh-huh.
And so for the Ives fans out there, you can see his workspace.
I've got to do
That
that.
up. It's a mind blowing thing because everything there's a Civil War trumpet in there,
Yeah.
Ornette, the hat that he wore. There's just if you want the full Ives experience,
Yeah.
that's something. So yes. So back to you, sir.
Well, yeah, the Ives tangent could go on for days on end.
Exactly. I won't ask you about your,
Yeah.
your your favorite chamber piece.
Yeah. But, so anyway, getting us back to 1987, and the Dead, they got into that second set. And
Well, before we go that,
yes.
so Phil then says, "Hey guys," to Cecil and Ornette, and me and Donardo. He says, "Hang out for the second set. We're gonna play free."
Yeah. Yeah.
You remember that? And
Yeah.
so that was an interesting invitation too, where he's like, we're telling them, we're gonna go out and we're gonna do our improv thing.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing about the Dead in that they always took it free in the second set, but the Dead had this determination to like play a different set list every night. And it was never a written set list. They discussed it, before they went out, but they kind of made it up as they went along in some ways. But if they were playing, say, 5 nights at the Garden, they could go 5 nights without repeating a song because their book was so huge. So occasionally by the end of a run of shows, they might have, and they wouldn't want to repeat what they played any of those other nights. They might not exhaust, but limit their improvisational possibilities because they had already played the songs that were most capable of opening up, into free space. And I remember that night at the Garden, with Ornette and Cecil there, I said, "Oh, it's too bad that they played such and such 2 nights ago because they really could have taken that somewhere." Yeah. So my comprehension of the set list that night was it was not their most adventurous juxtaposition of songs, but they did manage to get it, pretty out there and dissolve song structure and get pretty free.
Oh
So
yeah, it was.
yeah,
And the drum feature, I
yeah,
think.
the drum feature was always, and going to that shamanic place that Mickey and Bill could go with, not just the conventional two guys behind kits, but the drones and
And
the
I remember
big
there was panning going
yeah,
on too.
yeah, yeah,
And I remember this really amazing moment for me was they were in the middle of this improv and it was swirling and it had a lot of different moving parts.
yeah,
And I had this perception that the guys on stage were playing for two people in this entire arena.
right, right,
And I sort of looked and I'm like, they're just trying to communicate with Cecil and
yeah,
Ornette.
yeah,
And it was interesting because I knew that could happen. I knew it was very real. Having been in that position to play for one or two people that you want to be there. And so that was a really beautiful moment too.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I thought of that. I didn't articulate the same way as you, but I said, man, I knew how stoked the Dead were to be in the presence of those men, among 20,000 people in Madison
That's
Square
right.
Garden, and the whole audience was getting off on what they were doing. But yeah, that part of their music that was really not just directed to, but directed by Cecil and Ornette because they had such an influence on who these guys were. Their desire to play free, was in part inspired by those guys. So it was a beautiful exchange and almost a an act of compensation, like
Yes.
repaying a debt. So um, as I said, like Ornette had kind of a beautiful, you know, positive poker face on, just a little smile, and he was into what was going on around him. He was like he felt what the crowd was doing, and how the crowd influenced the music. Not in that cliche rock and roll way of like everyone stomping their feet and clapping. Usually on the one and the three rather than the two and the four. But it was that element in the Des music of the crowd being that extra member of the band, where the exchange of energy is really very fluid. And the Dead don't pander to very much to like rock concert convention either. So they would play in odd signatures, and they would not do the thing that really was designed to milk applause from an audience so much.
Yeah, they were loose and they were tight.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a jazz aesthetic. I mean, NRBQ, I
yeah,
think, is the
absolutely.
same aesthetic.
Yeah, very much so.
I think we've run into to each other at some Q shows a few
Yeah,
times.
well, I had the Herculean task of co-managing them for a few years, but that's a whole other episode. but interestingly, at the end of the show, like I said, I hadn't really, Ornette and I had exchanged a few comments because we were more into absorbing the music, but I can't remember what they finished with. It might have been Not Fade Away, but they came back for the encore, and it was Broke Down Palace, which is almost like a gospel song. It's a beautiful hymn like lament, and that's I saw Ornette tear up. Like that one really hit him. Like just in addition to everything else that was going on in the room, just that very simple sort of churchy thing really really had an effect on him. And that might have spoken to his Texas roots and being in church as a young man as well. But that really struck me. That was a beautiful thing to watch.
Yeah, and I remember Cecil moving around, and we stood for the second half.
Yeah. Yes. No.
We
No one sits in the second half.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I remember we were standing behind the soundboard,
Yeah.
elevated,
Yeah.
and Cecil was checking it out. It's interesting what you say about Ornette taking in the whole situation. When I interviewed Wayne Shorter for the Yale Oral History thing, uh, he we talked about Weather Report, and he told me that he and Zaunul would go to see bands like Yes and Genesis to check out the production and to check out what was going on because they were looking to make Weather Report more of a big experience.
Right.
And I was very impressed with that he told me that, and that makes sense.
Yeah. They didn't want to be confined to that. You know. Well, Miles said that about his electric music too. Miles like hated the idea of everyone wearing a suit and facing forward and playing right into a mic. So he got the rig where he could prowl the stage and play, and that it changed the music to change the physicality of how the music was presented. Um,
And
but I th-
all of us were coping with how do you get instrumental music across to an audience.
right,
So it's
right,
part of this whole idea of Cecil. Of course, Cecil's going to be interested in the lights because
yeah,
he's paying attention to these other musical experiences of that moment. And it's actually really fascinating to think about that because I think people don't realize those guys were full package guys.
yeah, yes,
Ornette's whole thing with how Primetime's set up and his hand painted suits.
right. It was about engaging all the senses, and having it be as much about the visceral as the intellectual, and yeah, that's why their music was so powerful. So, and it's funny when I first heard it, when I first heard free music, it didn't seem like an aberration to me at all. A lot of people take their time getting into it. Maybe it was because of having heard Ives and the Beatles at the same time.
Right,
That that it opened my ears to those possibilities, and maybe a lot of people don't have that opportunity, as I was so fortunate to have.
yeah, and it was also when I was hanging with Cecil, it was a sense of kind of like a mentorship that he was offering. I saw his world, and I got a chance to show him that I was, really dedicated to the stuff. Otherwise, he wouldn't, I don't think he would have spent that much time with me. But at the same time, I was young and, really doing music. So, he was open to going to see every musical situation.
Right.
That was cool.
Yeah.
He never had any kind of, oh, I wouldn't check that out. He was totally open, like I say, Kabuki or the Bolshoi or whatever it was. And it was remarkable because that meant that I could be myself with him musically. I didn't have to sort of front that I was like a post Andrew Cyril guy or Steve McCall, but he knew I had studied with them.
Yeah.
So he knew what I was going to bring to his music. And so by March of '89, finally, he was playing with Tony Oxley, and Tony Oxley couldn't make it for some gigs in the States, whatever happened. And he called me at 6 in the morning, and he didn't even say hello. He just said, "We're playing in Cambridge tonight. Are you available?" I said, it's like 6 in the morning. He wakes me up.
Man.
I have an office gig at this point, right?
Uh-huh.
I have to be at work at 8. And he's like, "Can you be in Cambridge tonight to play with us? Tony Oxley's unavailable." I said, "Yes, yes." He said, "So and so will be in touch with you to give you the information." Click.
Wow.
Then I had to call in sick.
Yeah. Of course. You
And my life changed after that, because
your priorities were right.
yeah, I had to call in sick. Yeah, and then we made the Inflorescence record for A&M, and John Snyder produced that record. So I wanted to tell you this John Snyder story
Yeah.
because the reason that Cecil and Ornette were icy together to each other that
Right.
night at the Garden,
Right.
which you didn't expect it, so it kind of happened, but
Yeah.
I noticed it. You noticed it.
Yeah.
They're not looking at each other. So John Snyder, who did Artist House records with
Right.
Ornette, he did Tales of Captain Black with Blood, all the Charlie Hayden records.
Right.
Remember Close? Was it Closeness?
Right. And Soap Suds.
Soap Suds,
Yeah.
Body Meta.
Right.
These incredible records. John Snyder told me that at one point, and I want to have John on to talk about this. At one point, when he was with Ornette, Ornette said, "I want to do a piano concerto version of Skies of America." So
Mm-hmm.
this is an Ornette story for all the Ornette historians. Hopefully you have some of this. But they only got to rehearsal point of this version, which was a piano concerto version of this orchestral piece with Cecil as the soloist.
Uh-huh.
They meet for rehearsal or like a musical meet to play and look at material and discuss. And Cecil's looking at the material of Ornette, and he's playing it the way he wants to play it.
Right.
And Ornette keeps coming over to him and saying, "Could you play more triads? I need you to play more triads." And this gets to the point where, of course, Cecil being Cecil and is not going to be told how to play, he gets up, he hands the music to Ornette, and he walks out.
Oh man.
That, I think, was the time right before, that was the time they had seen each other last.
Okay. All right. Well, I know they got past it later in life, and I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm happy to. I got a wonderful report of the last interaction between Ornette and Cecil being very, very sweet and very touching. So we can report that forgiveness
And then
was there.
also, you ran into Cecil after that and talked about the evening, right?
Oh, about we didn't talk so much about Madison Square Garden, but we connected every now and then. I believe the same person, Calico, God bless her. She also let Phil and I know that Cecil was in Oakland rehearsing a large ensemble for a piece that had been commissioned by the San Francisco Jazz Festival. And they used the space of the Oakland Jazz Club Yoshi's for rehearsals. And so Phil and I dropped by to see Cecil rehearse, and he was really happy to see us, and we chatted there. This was already a couple of years after the Garden, so we didn't really talk about that subject. The thing that really made Cecil happy was the Grateful Dead's Rex Foundation had an annual award, which was named after the great jazz journalist, producer, etc., Ralph J. Gleason. and it was for outstanding accomplishments in the arts, and they had given it to all kinds of wonderful people, not just in jazz, occasionally to composers of orchestral music, to people like Mike Seeger, the great folk musician and folklorist, and people like that. So in this particular year, they had given it to Sun Ra. And unfortunately, Sonny died between the time the award was announced and the time that the money was awarded. So it got distributed among members of the orchestra. So and Cecil, I said hi to Cecil. And he said I heard you people did a very good thing. And that award had just been announced, and he was very, very thrilled that Sonny had been honored like that. Um, and then after I started coming back to New York, first in kind of a bi-coastal way, and then after I moved here, I'd see Cecil all the time at the 55 bar. You know,
See, that's my other memory of him.
yeah,
The one was we had dinner like a couple of years after he had fired me, and we sort of made up.
yeah,
But I would play at the 55 bar with Mark Egan's trio, and Cecil would always show up.
yeah.
And one time he was getting ready to play with Max, and I remember he was sitting at the bar, and I came over and he said, "Bendian, I'm playing with one of your heroes right now." And Max, he knew that Max was one of my heroes because Max had been really nice to me when we toured Brazil with Cecil's unit and Max's quartet.
Hmm.
And I just actually talked about that with Fred Frith on the podcast. He was on that tour with Naked City with Zorn. And and so he says, "I've been working with one of your heroes, and you should be aware that he is, the greatest." He's like doing a whole Max blow up thing, and I'm going,
Right.
"Yeah, this is really cool." But then uh, he just got up and walked out,
Hmm.
and then he would like come back in, and like he was just always on the go.
Right.
And
Right.
and so it was funny to be playing at the 55, and then yeah, there he is.
Yeah. Yeah. He was there a lot. I mean, uh, I if not a majority of times I went there, enough times that you'd notice, always kind of sit at the same spot at the end of the bar. One of my musician friends used to say, "Yeah, Cecil's like the Norm of the 55." If you know Norm from Cheers, the TV show Cheers, he's kind of the Norm of the 55.
Which would say a lot about the 55 bar.
Totally correct. I said, "Yeah, that's more my kind of bar than Cheers was." You know? So,
Yeah, so many memories of 55.
uh, yeah, but if I can get back, a little bit of the after story of the of
Please.
the of the Ornette and the Dead encounter, that end of it. Um, I don't think it was much more than a week or 10 days later that DiNardo called me and said, "Hey Gary, my dad's working on a new album in primetime right now, and he's wondering if do you think Jerry might want to play on it?" And I said, yeah." It was like one of the great well duh questions of all time,
Yeah, like when Cecil said, "Do you want to go to see the Grateful Dead with me?"
Right,
Cecil
right.
Taylor, Grateful Dead?
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. I think I can make that work. So this was the album that turned out to be Virgin Beauty, and unfortunately, like Jerry was like fully booked for a while, with his own band and other activities with the Dead. And there was a little bit of communication snafu within the like Grateful Dead management hierarchy. I think there were some people who worked with Jerry who didn't really fully appreciate how amazing this was that that Ornette wanted Jerry to record with him. So there was some heel dragging and stuff. But eventually, what happened was Jerry made a separate trip to New York for a couple of days. Um, Basically, at the very end of the Virgin Beauty sessions, everything else was recorded.
So he
So
overdubbed for
yeah,
Virgin?
yeah, yeah. He didn't get to interact live, and he and Ornette always regretted they never got to do something from scratch, from the ground up. Just because of everybody being so busy and having so much going on in their lives. But Jerry wound up contributing guitar to three tracks on that album.
Right.
And it was wonderful. It was just Jerry's voice really fit in there. Um, and then some years after that, we had the opportunity to have Ornette and Primetime open for the Dead uh, at their Mardi Gras show at the Oakland Coliseum, um, and that was beyond thrilling. Then Ornette sat in with the Dead in the second half, which was only a 21-year dream of mine being fulfilled.
I wanted to
So
ask you who are some of the people that sat in from the jazz world or other that we'd be really interested to hear with the Dead
uh, David Murray a couple of times.
at the Garden, right?
Uh, yeah, I think yeah, at the Garden once and once in Oakland. And David also had a whole separate relationship with Bob Weir. They worked on some projects together. Um, maybe the most successful one, well, the one that became certainly the most popular with the Dead fans, Branford Marsalis fit them like a glove. Branford sat in most famously his first time, March 29th, 1990. He met them on stage. There was no again, a mutual friend of the band said, yeah, hey, I could invite Branford down to hang with you guys. And this was before I think before he was like the music director on the Tonight Show or anything like that. He was just
Before
like
Sting or after Sting?
after Sting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was a known quantity in the rock world somewhat, but um, and he just showed up. And Branford has one of those musical minds where he just hears what you're playing and he sounds like he's been working the tune. He's been deep into the book. He can like play back what someone else played, harmonize it. So by a couple of tunes into this, it was love. He wound up sitting in with the Dead, I think a total of 4 or 5 times over the years. So that was a really successful one. Uh, I always loved it when I airtoe, you know, and sometimes Flora would do vocalizing too during the drum stuff. Um, yeah, there were a lot. Baba Olatunji was an incredible force of nature collaborator with them. And then they'd have more conventional people from the blues and rock world. I'm not convention wonderful people. Bonnie Raitt, would sit in or someone like that. So I loved a lot of the guest people they had with them. Wonderful, amazing talking drum player named Sikiru Adepoju, who came out of Baba Olatunji's group and became still a close collaborator with Mickey Hart. Um, Master of the talking drum.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Mickey's world percussion thing has been so great. And
Yeah.
it's so important, I think, to, have people like Zakir reaching a wider audience
Yeah.
and all that stuff that they do. And as a percussionist, it just, I came up with seeing Ala Raka
Yeah.
with Ravi Shankar when I was a little kid. So I mean, world music percussion was something that fired my imagination. And so
Right.
we always were real into the fact that the Dead had two drummers and that they did a lot of percussion. That was always a really nice feature of the music, and the fact that Mickey's done a lot of world fusion.
Done a lot of world fusion and also became a preservationist of historical recordings of world music and an advocate for the preservation of the indigenous cultures whose music is threatened by industrial encroachment and political upheaval and all that stuff. He's a real force in all that. He's testified before Congress about the rainforests, and if you think about that only as an environmental issue, it's a huge cultural issue too, because the people who create that art and that music, are driven from their homes, and the oral history goes away. So yeah, that's an amazing story there. So anyway, so yeah, Jerry and Ornette just became incredible soul brothers who unfortunately did not get to work together as often as we would have liked, but I'm so glad that happened, and they had a great love for each other, and we're still in touch with we were in touch with Ornette right up until he passed. At one of my one of my and Ornette's joint birthday parties at the Loft, it happened to be on a night when one of the post-Dead bands, Further, which was Phil and Bob and a bunch of cool younger musicians, they had a night off in New York, so. But Phil couldn't make it. He had a previous engagement, but Bobby and several other members of the band came to the Loft and had a hang with Ornette, which was just lovely. So I have very fond memories of that. Uh, I have an amusing, way after the fact, Ornette story involving the Dead. Um, Bill Kreutzmann, one of the two drummers, for those who don't know, um, published a memoir um, a few years ago. I can't remember, maybe 2015, 2014, somewhere in there. And at one point, he wrote about how he had learned never to let praise go to his head. Because, and the example he gave was when Branford Marsalis had played with the Dead, he talked about what good listeners they were, how they really listened to each other and how they listened to their guest musicians. And Bill thought, oh man, that would just put me on the top of the world. And then Ornette came to sit in with the Dead a second time. This was not the show that he opened for them. He happened to be in LA at the same time the Dead were. So he came to a show at the LA Sports Arena and sat in for a little bit. And Bill writes in the memoir that after he came off stage, the Dead's manager, Cameron Sears, said to him, you know, I was talking to Ornette and he said, you guys sound like you weren't even listening to each other. And Bill was really brought down by this. You know, he was really bummed. This is like 1994 when this happened. And I read him writing about it in the memoir in 2015. And Bill just said, well, that just showed me that, you know, Bradford's praise, you know, I shouldn't take that to heart, you know, because it really bummed me that Ornette said that.
It,
But when I read that, I said, you know what? I don't think Ornette was saying what Cameron thought he was saying or what Cameron conveyed to Bill, because I remember Ornette saying to me once, and it may have even been the night the Dead were, he was at the Garden for the Dead. Ornette once said to me, you know, if you really know each other well, you don't have to listen to each other.
yeah, and I think that's a part of harmolodics too is the contrapuntal nature,
Right.
the independent nature of each of the musicians.
Right.
You get that in full color in prime time.
Right. And I once had a longer conversation about the idea of listening with Ornette. And he said, you see, if you listen to something and then respond to it, you're reacting to a moment that already happened. So his idea was that people should try to get to the next moment, you know, in their own way. And he said, if you arrive there together, that's beautiful. And if you don't arrive there together, that's beautiful. You
Yeah,
know,
Ornette was hearing, multiple strands clearly.
right,
That's laced throughout all of his music. You have that notion.
right. So he wasn't counseling against listening.
Right.
What he was saying that was when you're really attuned, when you're really empathetic, when you have the powers of anticipation, listening happens. You know, it's just a function of being conscious. So, you know, it was just a different way to talk about listening. So the next time I saw Bill Kreutzmann, he was playing with Dead and Company at the Garden, back home at the Garden. And I went backstage to say hello. And it was the first time I'd seen him since I read his book. And I said, you know, Billy, that thing in your book about Ornette. And I said, I don't think he was saying anything negative. I think that was a compliment. And I explained the context and what Ornette had said about listening. And Bill, this is like, he wrote the book like 20, 21 years later after he got bummed out by Ornette's comment. And he said, oh my God, that makes so much more sense. He said, I feel so much better now. So putting
It
this.
doesn't sound like you were tied to listening to the other guy the whole time.
Right. So, you know, he was so relieved and like just felt so vindicated. It was beautiful to be able to tell him that.
Oh man, that's so great.
Yeah.
Well, man, this has been such a blast talking to you about this stuff.
Absolutely. You know, I not only can talk about it forever, I feel like I have been talking about it forever since 1968, as far as the Dead go, you know, and also just talking about free music, talking about what people like Ornette and Cecil have given the world is like, you know, it's enriched my life so much, and sharing it with other people is just such a blast. I'm so glad you're doing it here too.
Yeah, man, and I'll tell you another little Ornette moment that I know you will appreciate. When he hired me to play timpani in his harmonic chamber players in
Mm-hmm.
2000. We had rehearsals. We had a gig at Battery Park Jazz Festival on the evening with his Sultan Khan, his Indian project with
Oh, yeah.
Badal and Donardo, and
Yeah.
his trio with Billy and Charlie Hayden,
Wow.
and then the chamber piece. So here's the first rehearsal. We have music put on our music stands when we show up, and we're all getting set up, and it's everybody's getting their instruments out. We're all getting set up. Ornette is chit-chatting with the musicians. He's friendly, getting everybody comfortable, and he comes up to me and he looks at me, says hello, and then he looks at the music on my stand, which, by the way, is basically bum bum ba bum 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 bum. And I'm looking at him like, okay, this is interesting. And it's a piece called La Statue, which was a piece he wrote for the Statue of Liberty to commemoration. And he looks at me, he looks at the music, and he looks at me and he says, I don't want you to play any of that. And of course, I'm like poker face, and I go, oh, and he says, I want you to do your own thing. And I was let to do my own thing for the entire piece.
That's beautiful.
And this is where, coming into Ornette's music, I knew that the two bass player concept was in play. So he had an acoustic classical bass player.
Right.
And I was the timpanist, so I thought of myself as the second bass player.
Sure.
So I was doing like double stops and different sorts of rhythmic stuff to interact with the bass player. And the only other person who was improvising in the ensemble, because it was all classical, largely classical players, was Lou Soloff.
Wow.
Lou Soloff was the trumpet guy on this gig, and he played amazing.
Yeah.
And everybody, it was funny because like Prime Time often did, as you will know, everybody had to do an unaccompanied solo.
Yeah.
And it would go around to the different people playing unaccompanied solos. And I've never seen anybody else do that. So it was kind of funny because classical people had to solo. And in 2000, that was a lot less common than it is now.
Sure. I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was a fun experience. And then we recorded after the gig, and Gary Giddens, I remember, was there, and he was someone that supported me when I was in Cecil's band, and thought, it's what he's doing is interesting, and so I got to talk to Gary, and DiNardo and I also recorded duets around that time.
Oh man.
So here's the question for Ornette enthusiasts and historians: where are those recordings of the La Statue? And where are the recordings of me and DiNardo? I'll have to ask DiNardo.
Yeah.
But certainly the disposition of those tapes, it's an interesting piece because I was always inspired by Ornette's connection to classical music.
Yes.
In high school, we had Skies of America. We had Poets and Painters.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know that record with the different chamber pieces?
Mm-hmm.
It's very inspiring. Here's a guy, he's going to do that in addition to everything he's done for jazz.
Right. And and then his deep connection to like Texas R&B, and like everything and gospel and everything. I mean, just it's he was such, I mean, just sitting and talking to Ornette was like, some of the most revelatory stuff that ever happened to me. People found Ornette cryptic when he talked because he didn't talk in very linear terms, but I never had a problem understanding what he was saying.
You could definitely sense what he was talking about.
Yeah.
But I don't know if on paper, I had the same experience with Wayne Shorter.
Oh yeah, Wayne. Yeah, Wayne is not a linear speaker, but yeah.
But on paper, it doesn't come across the way it comes across when he's speaking to you.
Right, because inflection matter and looking into his eyes matter. All that stuff connects. It's the same thing we said about them musically, like wanting to engage all the senses. Is true verbally as well. And that thing, that misconception that Ornette was being negative when he talked about not listening to each other. That you could take it that way, but knowing Ornette, I took it the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember the albums that had his notation system in the liner notes. We would study that stuff. Yeah, and his writings about music that would show up. Yeah. I'd always wished that there would have been a harmonic manifesto, but I don't materialized.
Yeah, it probably exists in some form somewhere, but not, I wonder if the people who would consider publishing it would consider it comprehensible. I don't know.
Right. Well, that's the thing. And but he was a communicator, and I like that a lot about Ornette. I had nice conversations with him about Dolphy and Jimmy
Yeah. Yeah.
Lyons, different, because I wanted to know if the alto players, that he was into or that were contemporaneous with him.
Yeah.
And then he did a wonderful thing for me, which was I was talking to my dad after sound check, and he came off of the stage, and Ornette walked like 50 yards to come over to me and my dad. And he went right up to my dad and he shook his hand and he said, "I want you to know your son's very talented. I really enjoyed working with him."
Oh, that's so sweet.
And my dad looked at me, I looked at my dad, and we were like, "Whoa."
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
so heavy that he had made the effort to do that. I'll never forget that incredible moment. And
Yeah.
he was that kind of guy.
Now his generosity to me was just extraordinary. Yeah. Miss him every day.
Yeah, and always listening to his music and different aspects of his music. A lot of the quartet with Blackwell was something that meant a lot to me. In the 80s, I had this recurring experience where I would go to see Ornette with the quartet with Billy Higgins, and Billy Higgins wouldn't be there, and it would be Blackwell.
Right. Right.
And so I got to see Blackwell in all these different situations where I was never going to see him, including one time asleep on the subway. One time I got on the A train and he was there. I said, "That's not because he was a big guy."
Yeah.
And I just loved his patterns and his touch on the drums. And
Yeah.
I just thought, I love what Billy did with that music, but for me, Blackwell, man.
Yeah. He was amazing.
And do you know that record, Ornette, where it's Scott LaFaro on bass?
Oh yeah. 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 Incredible. I mean,
That's a cool record.
yeah. I mean, LaFaro is a whole other chapter. Yeah.
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 But getting to see him with Charlie as many times as
Oh
I
yeah.
did was so wonderful.
It really was.
And these guys are no longer with us, but we still love their music, and it'll go on forever.
Yeah.
Well, sir, I appreciate you taking the time. It's really been a blast.
Hey man, a lot of territory covered, and yeah, there could be more chapters to come, as
We
far as
did
I'm
pretty
concerned.
well. We did okay.
All right, man.
All
Thank you,
right.
Greg.
So, everybody, thank you for listening. My guest has been Gary Lambert, and we're talking about some of the masters today, sending out a lot of love to Cecil and Ornette in memory of them, and
And Jerry.
and Jerry, and all the guys that we've been losing recently who have been so important to the music. And you know, the Oral History Project goes on, and trying to catch as many of these stories as we can of these gentlemen. Do look up my work on the Yale Oral History. I've done over 100 of these interviews with some of the masters, and just being able to get Sonny Rollins to talk about his work, and Henry Threadgill to talk
Yeah.
about his work, and these guys are so important to creative music, and their music and their words, because we want to try to find out how they're thinking about this stuff too.
Yes.
A lot of times they don't get to write that autobiography, so it's important to be able to chat with them, and to be able to chat with you, Gary Lambert. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks, Greg.